The man known to history as Edward the Confessor was born between 1003 and 1005 at a town near Oxford called Islip. His father was King Ethelred II, also known as Ethelred the Unready, who had acceded to the throne at just 12 years old in 978 after the murder of his half-brother King Edward, and his mother was Emma, a Norman princess of Danish origin born sometime in the 980s, whose father was Richard I, Count of Rouen. The reign of Ethelred the Unready, although initially peaceful, witnessed an increase in Viking raids that started from 991, when the Norwegian marauder Olaf Tryggvason invaded England with an armada of 93 ships and killed many of Ethelred's noblemen at the Battle of Maldon. Following on from this disaster, and in the wake of the deaths of many of his most trusted advisors in battle or elsewhere, Ethelred began believing his reign was cursed, blaming it, among many similar misdeeds, on his mistreatment of the Abbey of Abingdon during the early years of his administration, in which he had sold the abbot's post to the brother of one of his liegemen, Aelfric of Hampshire, one of the many men he blamed for leading him astray, and which motivated him to reform his ways after 993, in a period of his reign marked by a renewed commitment to God and the atonement of his past sins. In addition to following a new penitential path, Ethelred further tried to diminish the Viking threat by strengthening his bonds with the Dukes of Normandy, marrying the Norman princess Emma in 1002, yet this was initially less effective than he had hoped, as later that year he caught wind of a Danish conspiracy to overthrow his realm, leading to his sanctioning of the infamous massacre of St. Brice's Day, an attempted extermination of every single Dane in the realm, which witnessed atrocities that his new half-Danish bride would have looked upon in horror, and the consequences of which, for the rest of his life and the beginning phase of Edward's existence, he would have to deal with. Relations between Normandy and England at this time were growing increasingly strained by the fact that Normandy was becoming a renowned safe haven from which Viking pillagers were allowed to conduct their operations against Britain. However, and thanks to the intervention of the Pope, both kingdoms began to foster an alliance with each other from 990 and 991, which was officially sealed later on in 1002, following the marriage of Emma to King Ethelred, a union which has been viewed by many as the reason why their son, Edward the Confessor, who was of both Norman and Anglo-Saxon stock, and who had never fathered an heir, may have later promised the English throne to William of Normandy, who was Emma's great-nephew, and so a cousin to Edward, and who became William the Conqueror after his successful annexation of England in 1066. Nevertheless, throughout his life, Edward would have a complicated relationship with his mother, a queen so desperate to remain at the centre of the political scene that she was prepared to sacrifice anything if it got her a better position, including Edward, who she abandoned in 1017 to marry the Danish conqueror King Knut, only resuming contact with him 20 years later when civil unrest threatened to topple her. Edward had one brother, Alfred, who died in 1036 or 1037 without marrying, and whose murder would always be an uncomfortable point of contention with the family of his future bride Edith, and one sister, Godgifu, who married Drogo, Count of the Vexin, and then Eustace II, Count of Boulogne, after her first husband's death in 1035. In addition, Edward had one younger half-brother, Harthacnut, who was briefly the King of England, and one younger half-sister, Gunhild, who was later Queen Kunigund of Germany, who were both the products of Emma's betrothal with Canute as well as 6 older half-brothers born from Ethelred's first marriage to the daughter of the Earl of Northumbria, Ealgifu, namely Ethelstan, Ecgbert, Edred, Edwig, Edgar, and finally Edmund, the oldest, whose surviving son and grandson, Edward Etheling and Edgar Etheling, both of pure Anglo-Saxon descent, were later welcomed into Edward's household. Descriptions of Edward's appearance and personality only appear towards the end of his life, when he was around 60 years old, but even so, he is still described as being a tall and imposing figure with milky white hair and beard, a broad and flushed face, long emaciated fingers that let light pass through the gaps, eyes shining with humility, and a king who was gracious and friendly to all those he met, famed for possessing a remarkable degree of self-restraint he maintained despite the many losses and betrayals he suffered, and who was cheerful with a strong moral compass, blessed with good judgment that improved with age, and who treated his petitioners, rich or poor, with equal respect and dignity, contrasted with a darker temperament that occasionally flared up in sudden bursts of anger, but to all who knew him this quickly subsided, for Edward much preferred being kind to being cruel. When he was not engrossed in the day-to-day business of the realm, Edward, like many kings of his day, enjoyed the thrill of the hunt, an activity which in the later years of his reign he seemed to prioritize by increasingly offloading the responsibilities of maintaining law and order to his regional kinsmen in order to find more time to pursue his favorite hobby, which, even at age 60, he was still practicing and studying with the aid of the many illuminated books on falconry he is said to have also possessed. Edward was also an avid collector of holy relics, and although not a big reader, he was well respected throughout the realm as being an enthusiastic patron of the arts, and according to one commentator, his loving generosity attracted to the realm men learned in many arts, including many foreign monks whose discipline and devotion he is said to have admired. Although details about Edward's early life are hazy, some sources claim that as a young child he was taken by his parents to the monastery of Ely and placed on the altar there, wrapped in a pall adorned with light green circles, in a gesture that illustrated their desire to put the young princeling on the path to being a monk, and that until 1014, Edward, alongside his brother Alfred, was mentored by Bishop Elphin of London. Although it is hard to know if this particular detail about his early upbringing is true or false, what is sure is that during Edward's childhood, as the newest addition to the Anglo-Saxon ruling house, he would experience, either with his own eyes or from second-hand accounts, the destabilizing effects of the vicious Viking campaign to destroy England, led principally by the enigmatic Danish lord Sweyn Forkbeard. When Edward was born, the Kingdom of England was being consistently harried by Scandinavian warlords, a desperate situation that was compounded by a great famine in 1005, so terrible, according to Archbishop Wulfstan of York, that no one ever remembered one so grim before, viewed as a disaster of such apocalyptic scale that many in the Church attributed it to the final reckoning of God and the materialization of the prophecy that, 1,000 years after the death of Jesus, Satan would break free of his bondage to wreak havoc upon the land, an opinion also shared by the pious Ethelred, who, in a bout of violent religious extremism, removed 3 of his lords from their offices in 1006, gouging out the eyes of Wulfhere and Ulfgeat, and confiscating the territories of another leading thane called Wulfgeat. As Edward turned into a toddler, England was ravaged by a series of devastating Viking sorties in 1006 and 1007, which saw them pillage and loot every shire in Wessex, a wave of terror that only ended after Ethelred gave the aggressors an enormous tribute, buying him time to build up a sizable navy in 1008 to defend against future incursions, and which, by 1009, assembled at Sandwich, was the largest English naval force ever recorded. This period of uneasiness and anxiety was punctured by further personal tragedy for Ethelred, who lost 2 of his sons from his previous marriage to Algifu and Ecgbert in 1006, and the youngest of Edward's half-brothers, Edgar, in 1008, a tale of woe that continued into August 1009, when a Viking force led by the Danish Jarl Thorkel, comprising of Danes, Swedes and Norwegians, tore through Canterbury, East Kent, Berkshire, and up the coasts of Sussex and Hampshire. In 1010, with England being further pummeled by Viking assaults, this time targeting East Anglia, Ethelred despairingly turned to God once more by organising a barrage of spiritual countermeasures, including changing the images on his coins to the Lamb of God, ordering that on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday before the feast of St. Michael, that all his subjects should fast on bread and water in order to combat the devil, and insisting that every religious institution in the land should sing a hymn called "Against the Heathen" every day, in a flurry of desperate appeals that may have been some of Edward's first memories. Yet Ethelred's pleas to the divine remained unanswered, as the following year, in 1011, the Danish menace Thorkel, on behalf of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, returned to wage an offensive that ripped through the shires of the south, the east and the Midlands, followed by the premature death of yet another of Edward's half-brothers, Edred, in 1012, and also the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Elfhere, butchered in a drunken rage by Thorkel's soldiers after he refused to be ransomed. This year also marked the introduction of the herregeld, an exploitative tax that effectively made England a vassal state of the Danes, for now Ethelred was forced to pay a yearly tribute to upkeep the armies of the Danes, who in return offered their protection. Although the herregeld marked the ultimate capitulation of the English to the Viking scourge, it gave Ethelred and his royal court some much-needed breathing space, and Edward, a child of around 9 years old at this time, would have felt a sudden uprush in optimism as Ethelred and his 3 remaining older half-brothers, Ethelstan, Edmund and Edwig, plotted their next move. However, in July 1013, all hopes of extinguishing the Danish presence once and for all crumbled after an enormous Danish invasion fleet, arriving at Sandwich, proved so formidable that all of Ethelred's allies quickly surrendered, and although London remained the only borough to put up any sort of resistance, this quickly disintegrated after Ethelred and the rest of the royal family, completely outmanoeuvred, fled the country to seek asylum in Normandy with Duke Richard II, Emma's brother. Edward, accompanied by his mother Emma and his sister Godgifu, and his brother Alfred, were hurriedly flung into a boat to cross the English Channel, while their father met with them in Normandy after wintering with his fleet off the coast of the Isle of Wight. And it is thought that Ethelstan, Edmund and Edwig, who all had a claim to the English throne, escaped elsewhere to avoid sharing an uncomfortable period of exile with their younger half-siblings, and now rivals, Edward and Alfred. Edward's first stint away from his motherland, however, was short-lived, and in 1014 he returned to England with several envoys as part of a diplomatic mission to re-establish his father's position after the abrupt death of Sweyn Forkbeard in February led to a number of competing claims, including from Canute, Forkbeard's son. Moreover, in a further twist of fate, another of Edward's half-brothers, Ethelstan, had died in 1014, meaning that Edward's claim to the throne was suddenly strengthened, and with Duke Richard of Normandy seeing an opportunity to install one of his nephews on the English throne, it seems that Ethelred, who was at the mercy of the Normans, started to consider his younger son as heir instead of Edmund, Edward's oldest half-brother. Nevertheless, in the ensuing negotiations, Ethelred was reinstated as king, and looking to exact revenge for the 1013 invasion, he ordered an army to attack Canute at his base at Lindsey in an offensive so brutal that contemporary chroniclers reported that all the inhabitants that could be got at were raided and burned and killed, suggesting that women and children were also victims of Ethelred's avenging fury, which also extended to many of the thanes who had deserted him, including Morcar and Sigefyrth, who were lured to their deaths at a council in Oxford in 1015. With Ethelred viciously reasserting his dominance, and having strongly hinted that he would pass the throne to Edward, his oldest son Edmund sought to stake his own claim in the power struggle, rebelling against his father by riding to Malmesbury, where he freed the widow of the murdered Sigefyrth and married her to win the support of a large section of the English baronage, some of whom opposed Ethelred's return. But by September 1015, Ethelred was gravely ill, and the restoration of his power was looking more and more unlikely as he gradually succumbed to sickness. With Edward, a boy of 11 years old and hardly able to mount a challenge of his own, he instead stayed by Ethelred's side until his death on the 23rd of April 1016, and Edmund was left as the only serious contender to Canute, whose military prowess would prove much greater in the conflict ahead. Several months after Ethelred's passing, and after a series of indecisive skirmishes, Canute struck a mortal blow to Edmund's cause at the Battle of Assendon on the 18th of October, slaughtering most of Edmund's generals in an orgy of death that, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, took the lives of all of the chief men in the English race, including the irrepressible Aelfric of Hampshire, a man who had served the Anglo-Saxon monarchy for over 3 decades. Canute's triumph would be topped by the sudden death and possible murder of Edmund on the 30th of November 1016, and as Canute victoriously crowned himself King of England in 1017, Edward, having received his baptism by fire, scampered back to Normandy to avoid being executed, to begin an extended period of exile. He would not, however, be joined by his mother Emma, a woman who relished the trappings of power and who saw in the accession of the new Danish monarch a chance for her to reclaim her position at the English court. In July 1017, and to the resentment of Edward, Emma returned to England to marry King Canute, who divorced Aelfgifu of Northampton, with whom he fathered children including Harold Harefoot, in order to enter a matrimony with an ex-queen of England that would legitimize his authority and which produced a further 2 of Edward's half-siblings, Harthacnut, his half-brother, and Gunhild, his half-sister. As Emma became the new Queen of Denmark, Edward, probably feeling neglected and forgotten, forged a new life for himself on the continent, and although opinion at the Normandy court was divided over his presence, Edward was dutifully protected by them throughout his time there, and with the Danes consolidating their new English holdings, Edward all but disappeared from the political scene for 20 years. It was not until 1035 that he became relevant once again, after the death of King Canute on the 12th of November led to the full-scale disintegration of his power in England, Denmark, Norway and Sweden, and the rise in popularity of Emma's stepson, Harold Harefoot, as a rival successor to Harthacnut. With Harthacnut away in Scandinavia battling for supremacy against Magnus of Norway, Emma was unable to defend his position against the advances of Harold Harefoot and his sponsors, who started a violent campaign of usurpation, leaving Emma with no choice but to call upon her ancestral home in Normandy and her sons Edward and Alfred to help her crush the rebellion. Despite having been ignored by their mother for an incredibly long time, Ethelred's sons answered her call, and in 1036 they crossed the English Channel, with Edward going on to sail up the Solent River to reunite with his mother at Winchester, where he defeated enemy forces at a battle near Southampton. Yet Alfred would not be so triumphant, being captured at Guildford by Earl Godwin of Wessex and conveyed to the custody of Harold Harefoot, who blinded him so horrifically that he soon died of his injuries. Despite Edward's victory, he was eventually forced to sail back to Normandy after being ejected by Harefoot, who in 1038 further bolstered his power by banishing Emma, who went to Bruges to wait for Harthacnut and his army to return from Norway and to take back England. When Harthacnut arrived in Flanders, he had a mere 10 ships full of warriors at his disposal, but after increasing his flotilla to 60 ships, he was met by the fortunate news that Harold Harefoot had unexpectedly died on the 17th of March 1040, allowing Harthacnut to return to England unopposed, where he was crowned king, and where Edward, in recognition of his loyalty, was seemingly made joint ruler. But on the 8th of June 1042, after a short and childless reign, Harthacnut died, and, despite rival claims from Harthacnut's cousin, Sweyn Estrithson, and interest from Magnus of Norway, it was Edward who was crowned king at Winchester on the 3rd of April 1043 by the Archbishops of York and Canterbury at the age of 38, an accession that was greatly facilitated by the support of Godwin of Wessex, an accomplice in the gory murder of Edward's brother Alfred, a slight that Edward would never forget. With a desire to have a church of his own, one of Edward's first acts as king was to order the reconstruction of St. Peter's Abbey at Westminster, a building project which would be perhaps the one constant throughout a reign that was often as turbulent as it was peaceful, and the place in which he would eventually be laid to rest. Aside from this, Edward's earliest and most important political task was to win allies. For although England was now ruled by an English monarch who could trace his lineage all the way back to the first Anglo-Saxon king of Wessex, Cerdic, the brief possession of England by the Danes had left behind a strong Scandinavian aristocracy that was still highly influential and represented most powerfully by Godwin of Wessex and Siward of Northumbria, who had both risen to prominence under Canute, the man also responsible for the appointments of most of the major figures of the English Church at the time. Despite this, Edward was evidently more than happy to have the support of these lords, which was illustrated most saliently on the 16th of November 1043, when he rode with them from Gloucester to Winchester to punish the woman who had deserted him as a child, Emma, who was disinherited of her estates and whose henchmen, such as Stigand, who she had made Bishop of East Anglia, were removed from their offices, although Edward's retributive feelings did not last for too long, for she was shortly welcomed back into the royal fold. Entrenching his rule, Edward lavished gifts and honours on the aristocracy, saving the most important for Earl Godwin, who Edward made his son-in-law after marrying his daughter Edith on the 23rd of January 1045, a woman who was renowned for her beauty just as much as her intelligence and virtue, for Edith purportedly spoke many languages, read widely, and was a practitioner of many arts at the same time as being a devoted Christian of the highest morals. To Edith's biographer, she was not so much a spouse, but a good mother, who, as well as being an astute and trustworthy adviser to Edward, worked diligently to fashion his royal image from the first moment, helping him to exhibit the splendour befitting of a king by outfitting him with the finest clothes emblazoned with gold and silver jewels, equipping him with a walking stick made out of gold and the most precious gems, as well as a saddle for his horse embellished with beautifully carved birds and creatures, and furnishing his throne room with exquisite Spanish carpets. At least in the early stages of their marriage, the couple seemed very happy together, a fact illustrated by their joint visit to Abingdon Abbey when Edith spotted a group of children having lunch at an unusually early hour, and, in an effort to provide them with a better quality meal, for she was shocked that they only had bread to eat, Edith asked her husband if he could make a donation, to which he laughed and asked that he would do so if someone could provide him with some property he could gather the funds from. Edith replied, saying that she had recently been gifted a village, and that if Edward were to allow it, she would more than happily give it away, to which the king heartily agreed, remarking how it was a great idea. In fact, many commentators noted how, despite their troubles, the couple remained extremely close, and, according to one, they were like one person dwelling in double form. Another states that Edith was divinely joined to the king's side, and finally, that for Edith, no page of any book could please her more than one which tells of Edward's qualities. On the other hand, there were some who disliked the new queen, accusing her of stealing holy relics for her collection, and even ordering assassinations that benefited her family, who had all been elevated to the highest offices of the realm, thanks to her husband, including her eldest brother Sweyn, who was inserted as Earl of the West Midlands in 1043, her other brother Harold, who was given control over much of Middlesex, Essex, East Anglia and Cambridge, her Danish cousin Bjorn Estrithson, who was installed as the regional authority in the lands between Sweyn and Harold in 1045, and various other members of her clan who exercised control of all the kingdoms south of the River Humber, apart from Mercia, which was ruled by Leofric, one of the last remaining nobles installed by Ethelred, Northampton, which was administered by Siward of Northumbria, and Hereford, which was overseen by Ralph of Mont, the son of Edward's sister, Godgifu, the last three of which constituted the majority of Edward's personal power base, greatly weaker than that of the Godwins. In addition, the Norman presence in the kingdom was practically wiped out by the rise of the Godwins, marked only by the modest holdings of the two Breton lords, Ralph the Stala and Robert Fitz-Waymark, as well as Edith's personal maid Matilda, yet although Edward's private entourage remained extremely modest in comparison to his wife, he still held a strong sway with the church, his God-given authority there acting as a much-needed counterbalance and empowering him to make his own decisions without too much Godwin influence, such as in 1051, when he rejected the ascension of Ethelric, one of Godwin's men, to the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Furthermore, and in another indication of his influence over the church, Edward was able to appoint many of his own royal clerks, such as his German ally Robert of Jumièges, who oversaw the Holy See of London in 1044 and Canterbury in 1051, to the most important posts on offer instead of church candidates, further illustrated by the fact that between 1051 and 1057 there were only 4 monks ordained as bishops. Despite Edward's preference for his own men, he still enjoyed widespread popularity among the church, who were always suspicious of the pagan heritage of the Scandinavian faction, whose influence they much preferred to offset with Edward's appointments, even if it cost them a little independence. As well as the church, Edward also largely dictated his administration's attitude towards security and foreign relations. His experience as an exiled prince visiting many European courts during his 20-year stint away from England, no doubt coming in particularly handy, as demonstrated by the impressive list of sovereigns who congratulated him on his accession to the throne, including his brother-in-law, German Emperor Heinrich III, who was married to Edward's sister, Godgifu, Henri I of France, who was named as a close kinsman, and an unnamed king of the Danes, who was probably Sweyn Estrithson, who at the time was petitioning for Edward's support to help him ward off the advances of Magnus of Norway. Magnus had designs on the English throne and was viewed as such a danger that Edward prepared his ships to defend against a possible invasion by the Scandinavians throughout 1044 and 1045, a threat that only subsided with Magnus's death on the 25th of October 1047, to the relief of Sweyn Estrithson as well as Edward, both of whose kingdoms were saved from a Viking assault because of this remarkable stroke of good fortune, with Magnus being himself replaced by Harold Hardrada, perhaps traumatized by his experience in 1013 when he was forced to flee his homeland. Edward had no love of Viking warlords like Magnus, and as king sought to disempower them domestically by banishing Knut's niece Gunhild and her family in 1044, and prominent Danish landholder Osgood Klappa in 1046, while in 1048 he successfully fended off a Viking armada of 25 ships led by the pirates Lothan and Yearling, who sailed from Flanders to ravage the southeastern ports of Sandwich and Thanet. In fact, much of Edward's early foreign policy centred around containing Flanders and its ruler, Count Baldwin V, whose territories were a safe haven for the bands of roving pirates that consistently harried English shores, and who was prevented from causing more harm to England by a network of continental alliances Edward maintained with his brother-in-law Eustace II, Count of Boulogne, and Walter III, Count of the Vixen. Count Baldwin also damaged Edward's relationship with King Henri I of France, who, although on good terms with the English sovereign, was also Baldwin's brother-in-law and also the protector of the Duke of Normandy, William, a man who intimately knew Edward from his time in exile and whose family, after Queen Emma was stripped of her possessions, maintained increasingly frosty relations with their previous charge thereafter. Edward's friendship with Henri I would take another blow in 1049, when, working in conjunction with King Sweyn of Denmark, he sent a flotilla of ships to help the German Emperor Heinrich to quell the Lotharingian rebellion which Count Baldwin entered in 1047, an intervention that would have displeased Henri, who would go on to show his disapproval in 1051 by marrying one of Count Baldwin's daughters. Responding to Edward's aid of the German Emperor, Count Baldwin sent a raiding party comprising of 29 vessels headed by the exiled Danish lord Osgood Klappa to devastate parts of Essex, a situation made even more complicated by the fact that his sally was followed up by another one led by Sweyn, Earl Godwin's oldest son, who had taken shelter in Flanders after abducting the Abbess of Leominster in 1047 and murdering his own cousin, Earl Bjorn, before being welcomed with open arms by Count Baldwin. The chaos of the mid to late 1040s came to an end by 1050, a relatively calmer year in which Edward decommissioned 9 of the 14 ships he had hired from abroad to defend his realm from a possible invasion, extending the contracts of the remaining forces by just 1 year, at the same time that he pardoned Sweyn at the instigation of his wife. Basking in a temporary period of calm, Edward, who for whatever reason never fathered any heirs, was finally able to think about his legacy. and in 1051 Norman sources, written after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, assert that Robert of Jumièges was sent to the court of William of Normandy, Edward's formative home, to discuss the issue of succession, and that it was here that Edward first promised William the English throne, a claim, whether fact, historical fiction, or a mixture of both, for the Norman chroniclers cannot be entirely trusted, that the Duke would use as justification for his later actions. Nevertheless, as Edward mulled over who would follow him, he was feeling increasingly resentful of the Godwins' grip on power, and from 1051 the realm was plunged into crisis as Edward sought to reassert his authority over his wife's family. It began in the spring of 1051, when Edward appointed his German favourite, Robert of Jumièges, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, who immediately accused Earl Godwin of illegally possessing several church estates, a tension that came to a head in September 1051, when Godwin refused Edward's order to discipline the burgesses of Wessex after several citizens were blamed for starting a confrontation with the men of Eustace of Boulogne, Edward's brother-in-law, who was visiting the English king on family business. Edward was so incensed that Godwin had disobeyed his command that, with the encouragement of Eustace and the Archbishop, he convened a council at Gloucester on the 7th of September, attended by his army and the forces of Earl Siward of Northumbria, Leofric of Mercia, and Earl Ralph Mont of Hereford, while the Godwins called an assembly of their own vassals at Beverston, just south of Gloucester, in which they immediately demanded that Eustace and Ralph Mont lay down their arms, while Robert of Jumièges added more fuel to the fire by levelling an accusation that Godwin was planning to murder Edward, just as he had done to his brother Alfred during Harold Harefoot's failed coup. Although each side seemed ready for battle, neither wanted to start a civil war, and as Edward refused to back down, Godwin's position steadily fractured to the point where, with the support of the aristocracy, he was charged with treason and, alongside his oldest son Sweyn, was forced to hand over one of his sons as a hostage to Edward. As both armies made their way to London, and it was announced that Sweyn was now to be treated as a fugitive, Godwin's forces disintegrated by the time he reached his manor in Southwark, and his hope evaporated after he received a message from the king through Stigand, Bishop of Winchester, which stated that justice would only be served when Godwin could return to him his deceased brother Alfred. Earl Godwin took the hint, and alongside his sons Githa, Sweyn and Tostig fled into the welcoming arms of Count Baldwin in Flanders, while his other sons Harold and Leofwine made haste to Bristol and boarded a ship to Ireland, as the men of House Godwin were denounced as traitors and enemies of the realm by Edward, who, unsure of his wife's loyalties, imprisoned Edith in a nunnery. With Archbishop Robert of Jumièges recommending that Edward should divorce his wife, the Godwins' sizable estates were redistributed among Edward's supporters, including Earl Ralph of Mont and another called Oda, who were ordered to assume command of a fleet of ships docked at Sandwich, while Edward's coastal squadrons were put on high alert as he waited for the Godwins to unleash vengeance. Edward's scions in Somerset proved their loyalty and alertness when they repelled an attempt by Godwin's sons Harold and Leofwine en route to their father, who was waiting for them in the English Channel, to restock their 9 ships at Porlock, and thanks to Edward's royal armada, he was able to repulse Godwin's first attempt to retake his English possessions in June, harassing his ships up the coast until they were forced to retreat back to Flanders. In August, however, the Godwins were a lot more successful, with the Irish and Flanders arms of their naval forces successfully linking up at Portland Bill in Dorset before moving east, where they managed to enlist many men for their cause at Northumberland, and then the Thames estuary at the same time that Edward established his headquarters in London, where his land army, commanded by 5 of his earls, and his navy, consisting of 50 ships, were organised by mid-August. When Godwin reached London on the 14th of September, he established a camp on the south bank of the River Thames, to the terror of many of Edward's allies, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumièges, who, realizing that Godwin was prepared to risk everything and engage in battle, deserted the royal forces and fled for their lives, while some, such as Leofric of Mercia and Siward of Northumbria, stayed where they were but refused to help Edward, who was absolutely infuriated but, now realizing he was powerless, agreed to meet Earl Godwin at a council outside of London on the 15th of September 1052. It was here that Godwin proclaimed he was innocent of all the crimes levelled against him, forcing Edward to clear the Earl's name and to reinstate Edith back to the royal court, while all those who deserted the king's side were denounced as criminals. Although Edward had been thoroughly beaten, he managed to recover his position fairly quickly due to the convenient deaths of many of the Godwin entourage, such as Sweyn, his fiery brother-in-law, who died on the 6th of March 1052 in Constantinople while returning from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and Earl Godwin himself on the 15th of April 1053, who was replaced as Earl of Wessex by his son Harold. Despite the death of their patriarch, the Godwins, thanks to the behind-the-scenes influence of Queen Edith, continued to dominate the positions of the realm, with Edith's younger brother Tostig inserted as Earl of Northumbria after the death of Siward in 1055, disturbing the pre-existing power balance of Edward's regional lords to such a degree that the son of Leofric of Mercia, Elfgar, who had been made Lord of East Anglia, was temporarily banished and part of his duchy given to Godwin's other son Gyrth, after his attempts to claim Northumbria. Although Elfgar was eventually entrusted with the earldom of Mercia after Leofric's death in 1057, Gyrth was given the entirety of East Anglia at his expense, and similarly, when Ralph of Mont died the same year, Edward decreed that Harold was to be the Earl of Hereford, while at the same time another of Edith's brothers, Leofwine, was delegated a swathe of southeastern territories, a raft of appointments that meant the Godwin family now controlled most of England apart from Mercia. But far from being unhappy about the new status quo, Edward seemed to support it, for it guaranteed the stability of the realm. In fact, it worked so well that after 1052 he retired from active military service, entrusting the security of the kingdom to his lieutenants and preferring to direct affairs from the sidelines while he enjoyed more leisurely pursuits, such as hunting, as was the case in 1054 when he ordered Siward of Northumbria to mount an attack on Scotland, resulting in the defeat of King Macbeth at a battle in Perthshire and the installation of Duncan's son Malcolm Canmore as monarch, who would go on to kill Macbeth in 1057 and pay homage to Edward at Gloucester in 1059. Edward similarly dealt with his difficult Welsh subjects in the same way, in 1053 ordering the assassination of the Prince of South Wales, Rhys ap Rhydderch, after his border infringements into Hereford, resulting in the Welsh warlord's severed head being delivered to Edward's court, and in 1055, after the rise of the Prince of North Wales Griffith ap Llewellyn and his seizure of territories rightfully belonging to the English crown, Edward would select Harold to redress the situation, instructing him to invade northern Wales in 1062, leading to the near capture of the Welsh rebel at Rhuddlan. Griffith having escaped his grasp, Edward was next compelled to call upon his other brother-in-law Tostig to mount another raid of northern Wales, while Harold took command of a fleet of ships that set off from Bristol, a joint manoeuvre that resulted in the submission of the majority of the Welsh noble houses and the murder of Gruffydd by his own soldiers on the 5th of August 1063, confirmed by the delivery of his head to Harold, who dutifully sent it to Edward, who, most likely sitting comfortably at one of his palaces, ordered the brothers to impose vassalage on the fractured Welsh, an impressive achievement that highlighted the effectiveness of Edward's system of subservient lords doing his bidding, a modus operandi that contributed to the harmony and stability his kingdom enjoyed from 1052 until 1065. On the other hand, in 1065, towards the end of Edward's life, the system of governance he had carefully crafted, in which he trusted his earls to carry out his will, broke down with the collapse of the relationship between Harold and his brother Tostig, the Earl of Northumbria, a man whose brutal rule of the northern shires led to a widespread revolt against him that year in October, perpetrated by Edwine and Morcar of Mercia, the sons of Elfgar of Mercia, Leofric's successor, who had died in 1062, and whose offspring demanded that Morcar be installed as Earl of Northumbria instead of Tostig. When Edward demanded that Harold help out his embattled brother, he refused in much the same way as his father, Earl Godwin, had done in 1051, and, alongside many of the other nobles of the land who also disobeyed the king's command, allowed Morcar to seize control of Northumbria and to oust the unpopular Tostig, to the fury of King Edward, whose authority had been undermined yet again. With Harold having the upper hand and the sympathies of the aristocracy, King Edward was later forced to authorize the exile to Flanders of his friend Tostig, a man who Edward thought of as a brother, and whose bond was described by one chronicler as amor, the strongest term of affection that could be used in a banishment that would have likely torn Edward apart, and was, perhaps, partly responsible for the decline of his health that was about to follow. With Edward's trusted generals breaking the peace, the question of succession came to the fore again, for Edward and Edith were childless, something Edward was keenly aware of in 1054 when he sent Bishop Ealdred of Worcester on a mission to the German court of Heinrich III to establish contact with the son of his long-dead older half-brother Edmund, who had fathered a son called Edward Atheling, also known as Edward the Exile. Growing up in the relative safety of the German Empire, Edward Atheling had married a princess of German-Hungarian stock, Agatha, and produced 3 children, Margaret, Christina, and a boy they named Edgar Atheling. They enjoyed an influential position at the Magyar court, but when Edward Atheling visited King Edward in 1057 with his family, he died suddenly, leaving the question of succession more open than ever, especially since Edgar Atheling, the grandson of Edmund and a possible contender for the throne, was raised in the English royal house after the death of his father, whose passing paved the way for William of Normandy to stake his claim even further. In 1065, the succession dispute intensified after Harold crossed the Channel to meet William of Normandy, an event that has been interpreted by scholars writing after William's invasion of England in 1066 as confirmation of Edward's 1051 promise to bequeath the kingdom to the Norman duke. In several highly politicized pro-Norman accounts, including the famous Bayeux Tapestry produced to justify the conqueror's seizure of England, Norman scholars generally report that Harold crossed the Channel to Ponthieu, where he was received by Guy of Orléans, who then handed him over to William. Harold supposedly accompanied the Duke on a military campaign around Brittany, afterwards swearing an oath of loyalty that recognized William's claim to the English throne, an agreement that was confirmed by an exchange of hostages. On the other hand, Those looking to balance out the Norman accounts, and who believe no such oath was sworn, have suggested that instead of promising the English crown, as the Norman chroniclers assert, that it could have been something much more trivial, such as a declaration to marry into the Norman house that William was able to subsequently hijack for his own narrative. Whatever the case, soon after Harold's journey to Normandy, Edward's health started to deteriorate on Christmas Eve 1065, and although the king made an effort to appear cheerful at the dining table the next day, behind the smiles he was suffering intensely as Edith attended to his every need in private, and as Edward plunged deeper into the bowels of sickness, he summoned Stigand and his other bishops to inform them that the consecration ceremony at Westminster, Edward's most famous building project, on the 28th of December should go ahead without him. By New Year 1066, the old king, so ill that he could not leave his bed, reminisced about the bygone days of his youth and ominously told of a dream he had where the trunk of a green tree representing destiny was splitting apart, a harbinger of what was to befall his homeland, and in the few times he was lucid, the king reportedly denounced evildoers and agents of Satan, issued his final writs and grants with the help of his royal steward, the Bishop Stigand, his loyal kinsmen Harold and Robert Fitz-Wymark, and his devoted wife Edith, who sat on the floor and warmed his feet to comfort his passing. And as funeral arrangements began to be prepared, all who were by the king's side witnessed Edward making a last-minute decision that would change the course of history, as the dying king named Harold as his successor. On the 5th of January 1066, Edward died, and the dead king, with a circlet on his head and an amulet of the cross hung around his neck, was wrapped up in a shroud of Byzantine silk and conveyed to his funeral the next morning, a solemn affair in which he was transported from the palace to Westminster Abbey to the dirges, chants, and ringing bells of clerics, accompanying the crowd of esteemed nobles who witnessed the king's body being lowered into his tomb at the high altar, before they rushed off to watch Harold crown himself king immediately afterwards. A few years after Edward's passing, many people reported that they had been miraculously cured of their ills and ailments after spending time by the tomb of the deceased king, claims that kick-started the cult of St. Edward, which led to his eventual canonization by the Church. As the years passed and the reign of Edward became distant history, new accounts of his supposed ability to perform miracles started to emerge, such as the tale of a young woman who, by the king's hand, was cured of scrofulous glands on the neck, stories which led to a renewed interest in Edward in 1102 when Gilbert Crispin, the abbot of Westminster, exhumed the old king's grave and alongside Gundulf, the Bishop of Rochester, searched for evidence of his saintliness. But it was only after the release of Edward's biography by Westminster monk Osbert de Clare some time before 1138 that the notion that Edward deserved sainthood garnered mainstream appeal from the English Church and the royalty. The first attempt to canonize Edward in the late 11th century was unsuccessful after Pope Innocent II denied the claim, but hopes were revived in 1160 after Edward's case was put forward again by another abbot of Westminster, Lawrence, who, with the backing of King Henry II, was able to provide Pope Alexander III with the necessary evidence, including the account of Osbert de Clare and several eyewitness reports that attested to Edward's divine healing abilities, of which the Pope was sufficiently convinced to confirm his sainthood in a papal bull published on the 7th of February 1161. Edward was acknowledged by the Church as a holy confessor, which is a saint who was not martyred, and from then on was given the epithet the Confessor. But although at the time there was much interest surrounding him, his popularity slowly waned as the years passed, and was only briefly revived by his most famous devotee, King Henry III, who, as well as naming his son after the Confessor, also had Edward's tomb restored on the 13th of October 1269 during his reconstruction of Westminster Abbey. Afterwards, a modest cult of St. Edward survived quietly for centuries more before it was abruptly terminated with the accession of the Hanoverian monarch George I in 1714. Although Edward the Confessor was the last monarch of the Anglo-Saxon House of Cerdic, which could be traced back to the early 6th century to govern England, and though the first few years of his reign were fairly chaotic as he worked tirelessly to stamp his authority domestically as well as internationally, his reign after 1052 was for the most part very successful, a rare period of peace that served as an oasis of calm, a contrast to the mayhem so often associated with the medieval era. Yet it could equally be said that Edward was extremely lucky in that the unexpected deaths of others often served him very well. As a young prince, born into the brutal pandemonium of medieval Europe, Edward's first glimpse of life was death, his agent of fortune, as the famine of 1005, so devastating that contemporaries were convinced they were experiencing the final judgment of Christ, spread pestilence and starvation to all. Edward, being the oldest child of his father's second marriage to Emma, and having 7 older half-brothers ahead of him in the line of succession, was never meant to be king. Yet, by the time he was 11 years old, the savage and unrelenting medieval world had taken away the lives of every single one of his male half-siblings, and Edward was unexpectedly heralded as the rightful Anglo-Saxon heir, as the triumph of the Danish King Canute against Edmund in the Civil War of 1014 to 1016 forced him to flee into exile. Having escaped with his life and been abandoned by his mother Emma, who chose to start a new life as Canute's queen, Edward led by all accounts a comfortable life as a noble refugee at the Norman court, a 20-year period that served as a stark contrast to the bedlam that had enveloped his early years, and a time in which the future king would have developed the judgment, skills, and appropriate conduct that would forge him into a sophisticated medieval statesman, qualities that would serve him well in the coming storm that ensued after the death of King Canute and the breakout of a civil war between Harold Harefoot and his half-brother Harthacnut. After a brief campaign fighting against Harold Harefoot in 1036, which witnessed the horrific blinding and murder of his brother Alfred after he was seized by Edward's future father-in-law Earl Godwin of Wessex and handed over to the enemy, Edward was aided by death yet again after Harthacnut, emerging victorious in the struggle, passed away after barely 3 months on the throne. And as joint king, Edward was chosen in his stead, with the support of Earl Godwin, who had changed allegiances to govern the Kingdom of England. Edward's first few years in office were marked by a campaign to win over the Danish remnants that still occupied an influential place in society, significantly facilitated by his marriage to Edith as recognition of Earl Godwin's essential role in making him king, and despite Godwin's kinsmen dominating many of the most important postings in the realm, Edward was able to operate fairly independently and was still able to have the final say in most matters. On the other hand, Edward's reliance on the Godwin clan would have destabilizing consequences after Earl Godwin, believing he was above the law and the word of the king, disobeyed Edward's command to punish his Wessex subjects after their disrespectful treatment of Count Eustace II of Boulogne the husband of his sister Godgifu and his men, during a visit to Edward's court in 1051. Showing his true colours and a lust of a man sick with power, Edward was forced to face off against Earl Godwin and his sons, whose combined strength forced Edward to concede and to forgive his benefactor without a clash of arms. Yet Edward would strike lucky yet again, and his position would be somewhat restored after the deaths of the unruly Sweyn and Earl Godwin shortly after the showdown. From here, Edward was able to mend his relationship with the surviving Godwins, most notably Harold and Tostig, who became like brothers to him and to whom he subsequently entrusted the security of the kingdom against the incursions of the Welsh and the Scots, ushering in a period of peace and stability lasting well over a decade, and that abruptly ended when he was again betrayed by a close confidant, this time Harold, who refused alongside many of Edward's noblemen to help the unpopular Tostig recover his position as the Earl of Northumbria after an uprising against him by Edwine and Morcar of Mercia. With the heartbroken Edward left with no choice but to exile one of his closest friends, the king's health soon took a turn for the worse, and by December 1065, after missing the consecration ceremony of his church in Westminster, he lay on his deathbed, where the question of succession came sharply into focus. It was an honour which, according to Norman sources, he had promised to William of Normandy in 1051 and 1065, and which, according to other accounts, he had reneged upon, giving it instead to Harold as he lay on his deathbed at Gloucester in early 1066. Yet Edward's true intentions were lost to history after the triumph of the Norman conquest in 1066 and the slaying of Harold, who declared himself king on the same day as Edward's funeral, and whose defeat at the hands of William of Normandy at the Battle of Hastings inspired a raft of pro-Norman accounts confidently claiming that William, instead of Harold, had always been Edward's true heir. What do you think of Edward the Confessor? Do you think he was a man whose success and rise to power can be attributed more to the convenient deaths of his rivals than his own political prowess? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.